The rancher found the burned-out cavalry station on a Tuesday morning. 3 soldiers dead in the ash, and by nightfall, everyone in the territory was whispering that his wife had called down the Comanche, with mirror signals from the ridge behind his house. He had married her 4 years earlier when she was the only person willing to come to a house marked by a grave. Now she was the only person he wanted to accuse, and the only person he couldn't afford to believe was guilty. If you enjoy deep Western stories, subscribe for more and comment where you're watching from. The ranch lay 30 miles north of Spanish Creek, in country that was all distance and wind and the kind of silence that made a man listen to his own breathing. Thomas Brennan had inherited nothing and built everything: 700 head of cattle across 3 sections of grassland, a house of sawn timber and stone, 20 men working in shifts. He had done this after losing his first wife to fever in the 2nd year of their marriage, a death so complete that it had unmade something in him that he'd never thought to rebuild. The death had not come quickly. Sarah had been sick for 3 weeks, and he had watched her deteriorate in the way you watch a candle burn down slowly at first, then faster, then finally all at once. The doctor from Spanish Creek had come twice, had done nothing, and had charged money for it. By the end, she couldn't recognize him, and Brennan had sat beside her bed and understood that survival sometimes meant outliving the people you loved most. After she died, he had buried her in the small plot of land that was meant to be a family cemetery, though it contained only 1 grave. He had returned to the ranch and worked 16 hours a day, and he had developed a reputation for being a man of few words and fewer friends. He had developed the particular kind of loneliness that comes from choosing it deliberately, because chosen loneliness feels safer than loneliness that is imposed on you. He was 43 years old when he married the Comanche woman, though he didn't know her age. She had ridden into the ranch compound on a borrowed horse in early spring, walking straight to the main house as if she'd been expected. Her name in English was Mary, though he later learned it was a translation so loose it bordered on invention. She wore a gray cotton dress that hung past her knees, and her hands were steady in a way that suggested she had chosen this approach, the way you choose a path through difficult country. The first wife's death had left the house empty in a particular way. There was food in it and order in it, but there was no life in it. Brennan's foreman, a man named Callie, had hired a rotation of women from town to manage the cooking and cleaning, and they all left within a month because Brennan would not speak to them, would not eat the meals they prepared with particular care, and would sit at the table after dark without lighting a lamp, as if the darkness was something he wanted, rather than something he was enduring. Callie had been with Brennan for 12 years. He had worked for Brennan's father before that, had been present when Brennan had come back from the Eastern Territories with ambitions and capital and the beginning of what would become the ranch. Callie understood Brennan in the way that long service can create, not through deep friendship, but through the accumulated knowledge of habit and pattern. He knew when Brennan needed something said and when silence was the only acceptable response. When Mary arrived, Callie assumed she was another hired girl, and he nearly ejected her before Brennan came down the stairs and simply said he would marry her. Callie reminded him that he knew nothing about her. Brennan replied that he knew enough that she had the sense to come alone and the courtesy not to ask questions. They were married by a circuit preacher 3 days later in a ceremony attended only by Brennan and the preacher, and then Callie, who went because he thought maybe his presence might keep the world from ending. The circuit preacher was a man named Holbrook, maybe 60 years old, with the kind of weathered face that suggested he had preached in difficult places to difficult people. He performed the ceremony with the minimum words necessary: no reading of scripture, no blessing, no invocation of divine favor. When it was finished, he took his fee and rode away, and neither Brennan nor Mary seemed to think that the brevity of the ceremony meant anything. Mary settled into the ranch house with a quietness that was almost unnatural. She didn't rearrange anything. She cleaned what needed cleaning, cooked what needed cooking, and moved through the space like someone reading a familiar language. There were no songs. There were no complaints. Within a week, the hands had stopped noticing her. Within a month, they had begun to trust that coffee would be hot at sunrise, and that their clothes would be mended without them having to ask. The work she did was not fancy. The meals were basic beans, bread, occasionally beef when a steer had to be taken. But the work was consistent. There were no days off, no moments of neglect. She moved through the domestic tasks of the ranch the way a man moves through work he has always known, without complaint and without expectation of gratitude. But the town noticed immediately. Spanish Creek was the kind of place where a white man marrying an Indian woman was not scandal, it was information. It was something that revealed itself slowly, the way a water stain spreads across a ceiling. At first, people simply looked at Brennan differently when he came to town. Then they began to look at Mary differently. By autumn, when they came to town together, families would gather their children and cross the street. The looks were not hostile at first. They were curious or evaluative, or they held the kind of distance that comes from not understanding something. But over time, the quality of the looks changed. They became harder. They began to hold something judgmental in them, something that suggested people were watching for a sign, waiting for confirmation of a fear they hadn't articulated, but carried with them regardless. None of this appeared to trouble Mary. She rode beside Brennan into Spanish Creek with the same expression she wore, everywhere watchful, patient, as if she were waiting for something. She wore proper clothes, kept her hair bound, spoke only when directly addressed, and even then offered only the minimum words necessary. She made no friends. No one made overtures of friendship. The minister's wife visited the ranch once, found it spotless and orderly, received tea in silence, and did not return. After that visit, word spread through Spanish Creek that the minister's wife had found nothing to criticize about the ranch house, which seemed to disappoint people rather than reassure them. If Mary had been slovenly or disorganized, it would have confirmed what people believed about her. Instead, her competence seemed to suggest something more threatening, that she understood the rules of civilization well enough to follow them, which meant she could be deceptive about her true nature. But Brennan began to change, subtly, over the course of that first year. He smiled less. He drank more coffee and more whiskey. He started asking Callie detailed questions about the ranch operations that he'd never asked before: inventories of supplies, exact counts of cattle, the movements of herds and workers. He began riding the perimeter more often, and Mary would sometimes accompany him, sitting easily on a horse, watching the country the way a bird watches a field. These rides became a ritual of sorts. They would go out in the late afternoon, when the work of the day was beginning to slow, and they would cover the boundaries of the property in silence. Brennan would point out sections that needed work, areas where cattle had been grazing, water sources that were becoming unreliable. Mary would listen and watch, and she would occasionally suggest a different approach. A place where fencing could be moved, a route that would be better for moving herd, a water source that Brennan had overlooked. Her suggestions were always practical. They never challenged his authority, but they revealed a mind that was working, calculating, understanding the ranch not as an outsider, but as someone who had come to comprehend its mechanics. The men noticed this too. The way Mary seemed to understand the land with an efficiency that suggested either luck or something more intentional. The men noticed this too. The way Brennan seemed to be studying his own ranch as if he might be seeing it for the first time, or as if he were trying to memorize it before something took it away. There was a quality of desperation in these rides, though no one would have used that word. It was more accurate to say that Brennan had begun to understand that what he had built could be taken from him, and he wanted to know exactly what he stood to lose. 2 years passed. No children came. Mary continued her work. Brennan continued his watching. The tension between them was not visible to the casual observer, because it was not the kind of tension that expressed itself in shouting or distance. It was the kind of tension that lives in the same room as silence, in the same bed as restraint. It was the tension of two people who had made a transaction and were trying to determine if the transaction was a fair one, or if one of them had been deceived. Mary became pregnant in the 3rd year. She carried the child silently, the way she did everything else. Her belly swelled gradually, and she did not speak about it, did not prepare for it, did not seem to expect that anyone would acknowledge it. But the pregnancy changed something in the way Brennan looked at her. For the first time, there seemed to be hope in his expression when he looked at her, hope that this change meant something, that it meant she was committing to the ranch in a way that could not be reversed. But the pregnancy ended in the 4th month. Mary miscarried quietly in the night, and when Callie found her in the morning, she was simply lying in bed, pale but composed, as if this loss was something she had anticipated and was not surprised by. The doctor from Spanish Creek was called, and he confirmed that there had been a child, and that it was gone, and that there was nothing to be done about it. After the miscarriage, Brennan stopped asking Callie questions about the ranch operations. He stopped riding the perimeter with Mary. He seemed to retreat into a kind of internal calculation that was different from before, not hopeful, but resigned. The look he gave, Mary changed from something that held questions to something that held only acknowledgement of a particular kind of damage. The 2nd year, a man named Harrow came to the ranch. He owned land west of Spanish Creek, 1,200 acres with poor water and poorer grazing, and he'd begun buying up additional sections with money that no one could quite identify the source of. Harrow was 35, lean in the way that suggests hunger rather than ill luck, and he had a way of speaking that made it seem like he knew you better than you knew yourself, and that what he knew was not complimentary. Harrow had been sweet on the first Mrs. Brennan years ago, before she married. He'd been kind to her, brought her gifts, asked for nothing in return except conversation. He had visited the ranch in those early years, had sat with her on the porch, had asked about her life and her feelings and the ways that marriage was, or wasn't meeting her expectations. He had been present, in a way that mattered to a woman who was beginning to understand that her husband was not a man who knew how to be present. After she died, he'd expressed deep and specific grief at the ranch, and Brennan had accepted his condolences with the frozen courtesy of a man who had decided never to let anyone close enough to hurt him again. Harrow had accepted this rejection gracefully, had not pushed, had simply withdrawn and maintained a kind of respectful distance. When Harrow met Mary, his first reaction was careful politeness, but something shifted in him over the next few months. He began to appear at the ranch more frequently to discuss cattle operations, to warn Brennan about rumors of Comanche movement in the North Country, to suggest that Brennan might be overextended in terms of his finances. He began to suggest, very carefully, that a man in Brennan's position might not understand the implications of certain domestic arrangements. The conversations with Harrow were always conducted in Brennan's presence, always ostensibly about ranch business, but always circling back to the same point, that marriage to a Comanche woman was a vulnerability that Brennan was choosing to accept, and that this choice revealed something about Brennan's judgment that ought to concern the people around him. Brennan did not ask him to leave. Brennan did not ask him to return. Harrow simply appeared the way weather appears, inevitable and difficult to refuse. And over the course of several months, Harrow's presence became a kind of constant, a reminder that the world outside the ranch was watching, was forming opinions, was waiting to see how this experiment in domestic life would resolve itself. Mary treated him with the same neutral courtesy she offered everyone. But there was something in the way she would leave a room when Harrow entered it, something economical in the gesture that suggested she understood something about the man that she had no intention of sharing. She would excuse herself with a quiet statement that she had work to do, that she would leave the men to their business, and Harrow would watch her go with an expression that was not quite hunger, but was certainly not indifference. The 3rd year brought drought. The northern herds began to move south earlier than expected. The water sources near the ranch became critical, and men from other operations began to use them, claiming they were on open grazing land. Brennan didn't fight them on it. He simply ensured his own herds had what they needed, and he watched the men who came for water with the same careful attention he was turning on everything now. The drought lasted longer than anyone expected. By late summer, the grass had turned brown, and the water holes were shrinking visibly each week. Ranchers began to consolidate their herds, moving them south and east where the water was more reliable. Brennan kept his herds where they were, rotating them through the remaining water sources, and he developed a reputation for either remarkable foresight or remarkable stubbornness. People weren't sure which. Harrow began to organize a militia among the local ranchers. It was informal, no uniform, no official structure, but the purpose was clear. They were going to secure the water, secure the cattle, and ensure that the Comanche remained north of the territory. Harrow was eloquent about the necessity. He spoke of protection and self-preservation. He spoke of the Indian threat as though it were something already moving toward you, something that could be delayed but not permanently stopped. The militia began meeting in Spanish Creek in the back room of the saloon, and Harrow presided over these meetings with the kind of authority that people seemed willing to grant him. He had maps. He had information about Comanche movements from the north. He had ideas about where they would strike, when they would strike, what they would be after. And all of these ideas seemed to make sense to the men who listened to him. Brennan attended the first meeting. He listened. He said nothing. He noted the maps, the strategy, the consensus that was forming around Harrow's leadership. And then he did not attend the second meeting. But the men he employed did attend. Callie attended. And they came back with new certainty, the kind that fear gives you when it has a direction to move in. They came back talking about ambushes and raids, about Indians moving south, about the need to be ready for something that everyone could feel coming, but no one could quite describe. Brennan listened to Callie's reports about the militia meetings without comment. He did not forbid his men from attending. He did not encourage them. He simply accepted that the men were being pulled in a direction that had nothing to do with his ranch or his cattle, and he tried to plan his operations in a way that would not require the militia's help or the militia's interference. The fourth year brought Mary a year older, though her face hadn't changed. It brought Brennan a kind of interior exhaustion that seemed to rest behind his eyes like something waiting to be recognized. It brought the first real violence. A small band of Comanche, maybe 8 or 9 of them, came down from the northern territories and took 2 weeks moving through the country, acquiring supplies where they could and avoiding the militia patrols that were increasing in size and frequency. The militia killed 3 of them in a running chase that ended in a ravine 12 miles east of Brennan's ranch. The survivors disappeared back north. The chase itself lasted most of a day. The militia riders had spread out across a wide area, trying to cut off the Comanche's escape routes, trying to either capture them or drive them north. The Comanche had moved with an economy of motion that suggested they knew the territory, knew where the difficult passes were, knew where they could move faster than mounted men could follow. In the end, the militia had killed 3 and lost one of their own, a young man named Dory, who had been shot from the rocks and left where he fell. Dory was retrieved after the chase ended, and his body was brought back to Spanish Creek, and everyone agreed that this was the beginning of something, that this first death meant that the violence would continue and escalate. The militia's response was to schedule more frequent meetings and to recruit more men. Harrow's position as the militia's leader seemed to solidify after Dory's death, because Harrow had been right. The Indian threat was real. It was moving. It was going to claim lives. 2 days after the last bodies were burned, Harrow came to the ranch with 3 other men, all of them carrying rifles, none of them looking comfortable with it. He asked to speak to Brennan alone. They walked to the front of the house while Mary watched from an upstairs window, her expression unchanged. Harrow said that he had been patient. He said that he had watched and waited and given Brennan time to come to the correct understanding of the situation. But the raids were increasing, supplies were disappearing, and Callie had reported that Mary spent several hours each day on the ridge behind the house, where she claimed to be collecting plants, but where she was positioned in a way that would allow her to signal anyone in the northern country. He said that he had seen her there himself, moving her shawl in a way that seemed calculated rather than casual. Harrow's voice did not carry accusation in it. It carried something closer to concern, as if he were doing Brennan a favor by reporting what he had observed, as if his only interest was in helping Brennan understand the danger he was in. Brennan asked him if he had come to make an accusation. Harrow said he had come as a friend, and that what a friend did was tell you things that you might not want to hear, because that was what friendship required. Brennan said that if Harrow was his friend, then Harrow should ride away from his property and not return, until he could do so without making suggestions about Brennan's wife. Harrow did not leave immediately. He stood there, in front of the house, while the men behind him shifted their weight and avoided looking directly at Brennan. The silence stretched out, and Brennan understood that this was the moment where Harrow was deciding whether to push forward or retreat. He understood that he was being tested, that his response was being measured against some calculation that existed only in Harrow's mind. Then Harrow said that he would respect Brennan's position, but that Brennan should understand something. The territory was changing, the rules were changing, and soon enough, Brennan would have to choose a side, because there would be no neutral ground left to stand on. He said that he was telling Brennan this now as a friend, so that Brennan would have time to prepare for the choice before it was forced on him. When Harrow was gone, Mary came down from the upstairs. She moved through the house the way she always moved, with complete efficiency and no wasted motion. She began to prepare dinner. Brennan sat in the main room and watched her work, and for the first time in 4 years, he tried to look at her and see what was actually there, rather than what he hoped was there or what he feared was there. She was 32 years old. She had been Comanche, and whatever that meant, family, tribe, ties of blood and loyalty, she had lived with those realities for the first part of her life. Then she had come to this ranch, married this man, and entered a life where she was watched continuously but not seen at all. The ridge behind the house was high enough to see for miles in certain directions. It was a good place to gather plants if you wanted to gather plants. It was also a good place to think, to be alone, to exist in a space where the expectations of the people in the house below did not apply. Brennan had no way of knowing which of these things was true. And he understood, sitting in that main room watching her move through the kitchen, that his inability to know was the central fact of their marriage. He had married her because she came alone and asked no questions. But that same quality, that reserve, that refusal to explain herself, was the thing that now made him doubt everything about her. You cannot marry someone's silence and then be surprised when that silence becomes a barrier you cannot cross. The violence came in waves after that, the way violence on the frontier always comes not as a single event, but as a series of small catastrophes that accumulate into something that begins to feel inevitable. A week after Harrow's visit, a supply wagon heading north from Spanish Creek was ambushed somewhere between the ranch and the town. 2 men were killed, a driver and a guard. The wagon carried ammunition and preserved food, the kind of supplies that a militia would need. The community blamed the Comanche. Some people, without stating it directly, suggested that someone had warned the Comanche the wagon was coming. The ambush itself was reported by a survivor, a man who had been riding with the wagon, but had fallen back to deal with a horse that had gone lame. He had heard the shooting from a distance and had hidden in the rocks until the attackers moved on. He reported that the ambush had been coordinated, that the Comanche had known exactly where the wagon would be and had positioned themselves in a way that suggested planning rather than luck. Callie brought this information to Brennan directly. He said that the men were talking. He said that they respected Brennan, but they were scared, and fear was a thing that could change even a good man's loyalty. He asked Brennan directly if he wanted to continue employing a wife who might be signaling her people when the winds were favorable. The question hung there between them. Brennan and Callie had worked together for 12 years. They had built the ranch together, had lost cattle to drought and disease, had managed through thin years and better years. Callie was not a man who asked for favors or who made accusations lightly. The fact that he was asking this question meant that the pressure on him from the other men was significant, that his position as foreman was being questioned. Brennan said that he wanted to continue the conversation they were having, and after that, he wanted Callie to inform the men that if anyone had a specific accusation, they could bring it to Brennan directly, or they could find work somewhere else. No one brought an accusation directly, but the atmosphere on the ranch began to shift in a way that was almost imperceptible. Men who had worked together for years started splitting into groups at meals. The evening routine of the ranch, the casual sitting on the porch, the passing around of tobacco and conversation began to fragment. People started watching Mary more carefully when she moved through the spaces they occupied. They made sure to lock their quarters at night, as if protecting something. The watches became deliberate. Men would position themselves near windows when Mary moved through the house. They would time her movements, note when she left the main building, track where she went. It was not violent. It was not even openly accusatory. But it was a form of surveillance that had the weight of a growing certainty behind it. Mary continued her work. She did not react to the change in atmosphere in any visible way. But Brennan began to notice that she left the house less frequently. The trips to the ridge became less regular. The time she spent in the town became non-existent. She began to move through the ranch more cautiously, as if she understood that she was being watched and was adjusting her movements to avoid giving anyone additional material for speculation. Harrow came to the ranch 3 more times over the next 2 months. Each time, he had new information, new evidence, new reasons why Brennan should take action. Harrow was good at this. He didn't make accusations himself. Instead, he reported what he had heard from other people, from the militia, from the town, from the Indian agents who came through the territory with reports of Comanche movements. He made it sound like he was merely sharing what was already being said, as if he were doing Brennan a favor by informing him of the consensus rather than trying to shape it. The conversations followed a pattern. Harrow would arrive in the late afternoon, would ask to speak to Brennan, and would spend 20 minutes discussing information that Brennan could have heard from anyone else in the territory. But because Harrow was saying it, because Harrow was presenting it with the careful tone of someone sharing difficult truths, it carried a weight that the same information would not have carried coming from someone else. Harrow mentioned that Callie had heard Mary singing in Comanche to herself while she worked, a song that sounded like a lament, like a message, like something more than simple expression. Harrow mentioned that the Indians' agents had reported increased Comanche activity in the Northern Territories, coordinated activity that suggested they were organizing for something. Harrow mentioned that a man from Spanish Creek had seen Mary on the ridge at dawn, had watched her wave her shawl toward the north, had noted the specific movements with the precision of someone who understood what he was seeing. None of this was presented as fact. All of it was presented as rumor, as things people were saying, as information Harrow was passing along so that Brennan would understand what was being thought about in the territory. But the cumulative weight of these reports, repeated across multiple visits, began to solidify into something that felt very close to truth. The raids began to increase in frequency. Never at Brennan's ranch directly, but close enough. 30 miles to the east, a settlement was struck and 3 people died. 100 miles to the north, a cavalry outpost lost horses. At the northern edge of what could reasonably be called the territory, a farm was burned and abandoned. The Comanches seemed to be coordinating their movements in a way they hadn't before, moving with knowledge of where the militia was, where supplies were being kept, where the safest routes through the country lay. And every incident was quietly attributed to the same source, Mary. No one said it directly. The attribution was implicit, carried in the careful looks people gave Brennan when he came to town, in the way conversation would stop when he appeared, in the way people seemed to be waiting for him to take action, as if his failure to act was itself a kind of statement. Brennan did not defend her publicly. He did not defend her privately either. Instead, he sank into a kind of internal silence that mirrored the silence Mary had always maintained. He moved through the ranch operations, made decisions about cattle and water and grazing rights, and said as little as possible about anything else. If anyone asked him directly about his wife, he would say that she was his wife, And that was the end of the conversation. But he was listening. He was watching. And he was beginning to understand something that made the watching harder rather than easier. He was beginning to understand that the watching itself was a form of doubt, and that the doubt was probably justified, and that being justified in your doubts about someone was a form of cruelty if you never allowed those doubts to be resolved. He began to pay more attention to her movements. He noted when she went to the ridge. He tried to understand what she did there, whether she was truly gathering plants or whether she was doing something else. He watched to see if she looked toward the north, if she seemed to be communicating with something beyond the ranch, if her movements had a purpose that was hidden from him. But watching her revealed nothing except that she was competent and careful, and that she moved through the world with a kind of grace that made everything she did look intentional. It was impossible to know from observation alone whether her movements were innocent or deceptive, because she performed both with the same economy of motion. 6 months after Harrow's first visit to the ranch, a cavalry officer came through Spanish Creek with a formal request for assistance in tracking a band of Comanche that had hit the supply line twice in 2 weeks. The officer was young, maybe 25, with the kind of official manner that suggested he'd learned his diplomacy from a manual. He was blond, with a face that hadn't yet learned to hide disappointment, and he carried himself with the kind of careful formality that suggested he was not quite comfortable with his position. He held a meeting with the local ranchers and militia leaders, and he outlined a plan. There was a canyon 30 miles north, at the edge of the developed territory. The Comanche seemed to be using it as a staging point. If the militia and a few skilled ranchers could move north, set positions on the canyon walls, and hold them, the next raid would trap the Comanche between the canyon walls and the cavalry moving in from the north. It would be clean and decisive, according to the officer. A small group of trained men could hold a canyon against a larger force, especially if that larger force was caught by surprise. The plan made tactical sense. The canyon was narrow enough that numbers wouldn't matter. The militia could position themselves on the high ground, and the Comanche would be forced to either fight their way through or retreat into the cavalry's waiting guns. It was the kind of plan that sounded inevitable, the kind of plan that assumed victory before the battle was joined. Harrow immediately volunteered. So did 5 other local ranchers. The officer asked if anyone else wanted to contribute men. Callie looked at Brennan, and Brennan realized that Callie was asking whether he wanted to send men, or whether he wanted to object to the whole enterprise. Brennan said that his men had enough to do with the ranch. The officer accepted this without comment. But Harrow, standing nearby, made a small motion with his head that suggested he understood the refusal meant something more than a simple lack of availability. He understood that Brennan was not supporting the operation. He understood that Brennan might be hoping the operation would fail. They left before dawn, 12 men and the cavalry officer, riding north with supplies for a week. Callie reported to Brennan that the men were saying this would be the end of the Comanche problem in the territory. That once the canyon ambush worked, the rest of the band would flee farther north, and the territory would be safe again. That Harrow was already talking about using the military victory to leverage a political position, maybe even a seat on the territorial council when elections came around. Brennan listened to this and said nothing. But he understood that Harrow had positioned himself at the center of the territory's future, that a successful canyon operation would validate everything Harrow had been saying, that Brennan's refusal to participate could be painted as cowardice or complicity, depending on how events unfolded. Mary was in the kitchen when the riders left. Brennan was certain of this because he had positioned himself where he could see her, and he had watched her move from the stove to the window, had seen her look out at the departing riders, had tried to read whatever was in her face. Her expression was unchanged. She watched the men leave, and then she returned to whatever task she had been performing. Whether she saw the riders leave, whether she had seen them preparing to leave the night before, whether she had done anything to communicate their departure to anyone else, none of this was visible to Brennan. And that invisibility was the problem that seemed to consume more and more of his thinking. The canyon operation lasted 3 days. On the morning of the 4th day, Harrow came back, alone, on a horse that was badly lathered, as if it had been ridden hard for hours. He was covered in dust. His face was set in an expression that Brennan had not seen before, something between anger and something else, something that looked like the face of a man whose certainty had been shaken. He rode straight to Brennan's house, and the two men talked on the porch while the hands began to gather at a distance, watching. Harrow's voice was not loud, but it carried enough that people could hear fragments. Canyon, wrong, nowhere, nothing. Harrow stayed for less than 10 minutes. When he left, his expression was harder than Brennan had ever seen it. He rode straight through the ranch compound and out onto the northern road without acknowledging anyone. Later, Callie came to Brennan and asked what had happened. Brennan said that he didn't know the full story yet, and when he did, he would tell the men what they needed to know. But the truth was that Brennan knew enough. Harrow's expression had told him that the canyon ambush had failed, that the Comanche had not been surprised, that they had either known about the plan or had chosen a different time to use the canyon, and the militia had set an ambush that had caught nothing but wind. The question that Brennan could not answer, the question that was beginning to consume him, was whether Mary had had anything to do with the canyon's failure, or whether that question even mattered anymore. Because whether she had warned them or not, Harrow believed she had. And in this territory, at this moment, belief was the same as fact. Over the next week, pieces of the story came through the territory in fragments. A writer came from the north with official reports. A militia member who had gone with the operation came through Spanish Creek and spoke to Callie. Letters arrived addressed to various ranchers. The story that emerged was fragmented but clear enough. Something had gone wrong. One of the militia had been killed in the canyon, a man named Desch, who worked for a rancher 5 miles east. 3 of the Comanche had been killed as well, in a running fight that had lasted several hours and had ranged across the difficult terrain of the canyon. But the main band, the organized group that everyone had been chasing for months, had not appeared at all. They had struck a settlement 30 miles to the south at the same time the militia was waiting in the canyon. It was almost as if, the story went, someone had warned them away from the canyon and toward the easier targets. The settlement that had been struck was small, only 8 people, a family and 2 hired hands. 2 people had been killed in the initial attack. The survivors had fled south, and the Comanche had burned what they couldn't carry. The militia had found the burned buildings when they finally realized that the canyon had been a feint, and they had ridden south in pursuit. But by then the Comanche were already north of the militia, already moving back into the territories where the cavalry couldn't easily follow. Harrow began to move openly now. He organized evening meetings at the Spanish Creek Saloon, and he spoke to anyone who would listen about the necessity of action. He didn't name Mary specifically, but he didn't need to. He spoke about traitors, about the dangers of being soft in a dangerous world, about the way weakness could look like mercy. He spoke about how one person, working for an enemy, could undermine everything the militia was trying to accomplish. His rhetoric was careful. He never made a direct accusation. He simply described a situation, a military operation, that had failed because of information that the enemy must have possessed, information that could only have come from someone on the inside. He spoke about the Settler family that had died, about the children who had been in that house, about the ways that the Comanche respected no boundaries when they were operating with intelligence. He spoke about the necessity of action, about the way that waiting was itself a choice that had consequences. He spoke about how the militia had been willing to put their lives at risk in the canyon while someone else had been warning the enemy where to strike instead. On a Thursday evening, 6 days after the failed canyon ambush, Harrow came to the ranch with 15 men behind him. They didn't come armed, not visibly, but Brennan could see that most of them were carrying weapons under their coats or at their waists. The men looked uncomfortable, which made them more dangerous rather than less. These were not men who had chosen to be here. They were men who had been persuaded that they needed to be here, which meant they would feel justified in whatever they did. Harrow asked to speak to Brennan alone, the same way he had asked before. This time, Brennan did not agree. He asked Harrow to say what he had come to say in front of the ranch, in front of Callie and the hands who were watching from across the compound. He said that whatever Harrow had to say was going to be spread through the territory regardless, and he might as well say it here where Brennan could respond directly. Harrow smiled at this, as if Brennan had just proven something Harrow had suspected all along. He said that he respected Brennan too much to force a confrontation that could end badly for a man he had always liked. But he wanted Brennan to understand the position he was putting himself in. He said that the territory was unsafe. He said that people were frightened. He said that one woman, one act of communication, one warning sent at the right moment had resulted in the death of a militia member and the destruction of a settler family. Harrow's voice did not carry anger in it. It carried something that sounded like regret, like he was sad about this situation, but understood that it was necessary to address it. He said that he was offering Brennan a way out of this that would preserve Brennan's standing in the community. He said that Brennan could send Mary away today, right now, and the matter would be resolved. Harrow would personally ensure that no one blamed Brennan for being seduced by something that looked civilized, but was still fundamentally wild. Brennan asked him what he meant by resolved. Harrow said that he didn't want to spell it out, but that there were ways for situations like this to be handled, and most of them didn't end well for everyone involved. The cleanest way would be for Mary to simply leave to go back to her people, or to disappear, or to accept whatever Harrow was offering to arrange, and then everything could return to normal. The militia could continue its work without the handicap of having information leaked to the enemy. The territory could continue to organize itself for what was coming. And Brennan could continue to operate his ranch without the stain of being the man whose wife had betrayed the community. Brennan said that Mary was his wife, and this was her home, and that was the end of the discussion. Harrow was quiet for a long moment. His men shifted their weight behind him. One of them adjusted the rifle that was just barely concealed under his coat. Brennan understood that this was the moment where things could tip in different directions, where Harrow was calculating whether to push forward or retreat. Then Harrow said that Brennan was making a mistake that would cost him more than he understood. He said that he had been patient because Brennan was a good man, but good men could be foolish, and foolishness in this territory had consequences that other territories might not allow. He said that this situation was going to resolve itself one way or another, and Brennan could participate in that resolution or could watch it happen. But he couldn't prevent it. Then Harrow turned and rode away with his 15 men, and Brennan stood on his porch and watched them go, and felt the weight of something shifting in the territory around him. The center had moved. The standoff had ended. Something was going to have to give. That night, Brennan and Mary ate dinner together in a silence that was different from the normal silence between them. This silence had a texture to it. This silence was something they both understood meant something. The food was the same as it always was, beef and bread and beans. Mary moved through the process of eating with her usual economy. She didn't look at Brennan. She looked at her plate, at her hands, at the window where the evening light was fading. Brennan tried to eat but found that he couldn't. The food turned to something difficult in his mouth. After the meal, Brennan asked Mary where she had been on the morning the militia rode north to the canyon. He asked it casually, the way you might ask about the weather. But they both knew it wasn't a casual question. Mary said that she had been in the kitchen, as she always was in the morning. Brennan asked her if she had seen the militia riders leave. Mary said that she had heard them, yes. Brennan asked her how she had heard them, if she was in the kitchen on the other side of the house. Mary said that the sound carried sometimes, depending on the wind. Brennan sat with this answer. It was technically possible. Sound did carry. The wind could have brought the noise of the riders from the eastern side of the compound through the house. But this answer also left open the possibility that she had been outside, that she had watched them leave, that she had done something before they left. Brennan asked her if she had ever met anyone from the Comanche band that was operating in the territory. He asked if she had any family among them. He asked if she had any obligation to them, any tie that would pull her toward them rather than toward him. Mary set down her cup of coffee and looked at him directly. She said that she had had a family once. She said that family was not something you could simply step out of, the way you step out of a room. She said that she had come to this ranch and married him, and she had kept the boundaries of this place as well as she was able. She said that she understood what was being asked of her, to sever ties, to deny connections, to become something entirely other than what she had been. And then she said something that seemed to cost her a specific effort to say, which was that she had believed he would come to understand eventually that she had made her choice, and that choice meant something. Brennan asked her if that choice included warning the Comanche about the canyon. Mary did not answer. She stood up and cleared the table, and Brennan understood that she had answered his question by refusing to answer it. And he understood that this refusal was itself an answer, but he couldn't know for certain whether it confirmed his fears or whether it was simply the answer of someone who had decided that some questions didn't deserve to be answered. The thing that arrived in the territory in the 7th week was not a specific person or a specific event. It was news. Bad news, the kind that moved from person to person, the way a fire moves through dry grass. The cavalry officer who had organized the canyon ambush had been ordered north to a larger base near the territorial line. Before he left, he had reviewed his notes about the operation. And in those notes, he had recorded something that didn't make sense until someone explained it to him. The Comanche band that had been raiding the territory for 6 months was not operating as a unified group. Instead, it was operating as 2 separate groups, a larger group, maybe 30 or 40 individuals that seemed to be hunting supply lines and cavalry movements, and a smaller group, maybe 10 individuals that seemed to be deliberately creating diversions. The smaller group would strike at a settlement or a ranch, draw the militia's attention, and then disappear north. This would pull the militia's resources in one direction, while the larger group moved resources in a different direction. It was coordinated, it was sophisticated, and it was designed to create chaos rather than to sustain it. When the cavalry officer reviewed his canyon notes, he realized something that made him ride back to Spanish Creek to speak with the local militia directly. The canyon ambush had failed not because the Comanche had known about it, but because the smaller, diversionary group had struck the southern settlement at exactly the moment the larger group would have arrived at the canyon. This timing was not a coincidence. It was planned. But here was the thing that changed the nature of the accusation. The larger group had never intended to use the canyon. They had known exactly where the militia was positioned, and they had avoided it not because they had been warned away, but because they had already decided to strike somewhere else. The smaller group had simply done what they always did, created a problem that looked urgent and pulled resources toward it. The cavalry officer came to the conclusion that someone in the militia was being fed information by someone outside the militia, because the only way this level of coordination could happen was if someone understood what the militia was planning before the militia executed the plan, and therefore could coordinate a distraction that would pull resources away at exactly the right moment. But it wasn't the Comanche woman. It never had been. The officer's theory pointed to someone else entirely. The officer took this theory to Harrow directly. He came to Harrow's ranch and laid out his evidence, the maps, the timing, the movements. He said that he had reviewed the movements over 6 months, and he had traced the pattern of where the Comanche appeared and when. And in every case, there was someone from the militia who had advanced knowledge of the operation. Someone was feeding them information. Someone was coordinating with them. Harrow listened to this carefully. He asked questions that were intelligent and seemed to come from a place of genuine inquiry. He asked about sources, about how certain the officer could be, about what evidence would be necessary to prove this theory. Then he asked the officer if he could prove this. The officer said that he could narrow it down to 5 people who had been present at each planning meeting. But he couldn't prove it without more time, and the militia didn't have more time. The Comanche seemed to be consolidating. They were getting stronger, not weaker. Another coordinated strike, another one that worked, and the territory would be lost. Harrow asked the officer if he had shared this theory with anyone else. The officer said that he hadn't. He had come to Harrow because Harrow was the militia leader, and the officer assumed that Harrow would want to be the first to know if there was a traitor inside the organization. Harrow said that he appreciated that, and he asked the officer to keep this theory private until they could gather more information. He said that false accusations could be as damaging as the betrayal itself, and he wanted to be certain before they moved. The officer agreed, and he rode back north with the understanding that Harrow would investigate the matter quietly and report back with his findings. But Harrow did not investigate quietly. Instead, Harrow did something far more purposeful. He took the officer's theory, which was correct, which was that someone inside the militia was feeding information to the Comanche, and he inverted it. He began to suggest that there was evidence that Mary had been communicating with the Comanche before the officer's theory was even considered. He suggested that there had been meetings, warnings, coordinated movements. He suggested that everything the officer believed had happened was actually the result of a single traitor working from inside the ranch. And because the officer's theory seemed to confirm that there was definitely a traitor operating in the territory, and because the officer had narrowed the suspects to 5 militia members but couldn't prove which one, Harrow's alternate theory that the traitor was Mary seemed plausible enough that it could survive in the space where proof was impossible to obtain. The way the story spread was almost elegant in its simplicity. Harrow didn't push it. He simply allowed it to exist in conversations, to be mentioned by people who had heard it from other people, to accumulate the weight of repeated telling without his fingerprints on any single version. 2 weeks after the cavalry officer's visit, Brennan received a visitor, a man named Waller, who was one of the 5 militia members the officer had identified as a suspect. Waller was a small man, maybe 50, with the lean look of someone who had spent his whole life on difficult land. He came to the ranch in the evening and asked to speak to Brennan privately. Brennan took him into the study and closed the door. The study was the only room in the house where Brennan kept books, where he had kept Sarah's letters to him, where he had sat alone after her death trying to understand what his life was supposed to be without her. Waller said that he had information. He said that Harrow was planning to take action against Mary within the week, that Harrow had gathered enough men and enough support from Spanish Creek that Brennan would not be able to stop what was coming. He said that Harrow had also identified Waller himself as a suspect in the traitor investigation the cavalry officer had begun, and Waller wanted Brennan to know that Waller was not the traitor. Waller said that he had worked for Brennan for 8 years, and before that he had worked for Brennan's father, and he would not betray a man who had given him honest work. Brennan asked him what Harrow was planning to do. Waller said that Harrow was planning to ride to the ranch with enough men that resistance would be futile, and he was going to take Mary from the house. After that, Waller said, the outcome was not something he could describe with certainty, but it would be the kind of justice that the territory believed was necessary. He meant that Mary would disappear. He meant that whatever happened to her would happen in a way that could not be reported or acknowledged. Brennan asked Waller how he knew this. Waller said that he had a friend in Spanish Creek, a bartender, who had heard Harrow speaking to his inner circle of men. Waller said that Harrow believed he was protecting the territory, and Harrow was good enough at persuasion that many men were beginning to believe it with him. Waller said that he had tried to speak against it, to suggest that Harrow might be wrong about Mary, but that his opposition had only confirmed people's suspicion that Waller was the actual traitor, was the person the cavalry officer was looking for. Then Waller said something else, and this was the part that seemed to cost him effort to say. He said that he believed Mary was innocent. He said that he didn't have proof, but he had watched her for 4 years, and he didn't believe she was the kind of person who would do what she was being accused of. But he also knew that belief didn't matter in this situation. Harrow was moving, and Harrow had momentum, and momentum was the closest thing to truth that the territory had. Brennan asked Waller what he should do. Waller said that Brennan should probably send Mary away. Send her north, send her east, send her anywhere that wasn't here. Get her away before Harrow arrived, and then maybe the situation would resolve itself. Harrow wouldn't be able to take action against someone who wasn't present. The violence would have nowhere to land. Brennan said that Mary was his wife, and he didn't send his wife away because a man with bad intentions had made threats. Waller said that Brennan was in love with an idea of Mary, not with Mary herself. And that in this territory, that distinction mattered. That in this territory, what people believed about you was more real than what was actually true about you. He said that Brennan could fight Harrow, could stand on his porch and refuse, could make a stand. But that stand would cost blood, would cost lives, would result in Mary's death or disappearance anyway, and would leave Brennan with the additional cost of violence that might have been prevented. Then Waller left, and Brennan was alone again with the knowledge that time was collapsing, that something was going to force itself toward resolution, whether he wanted it to or not. That night, Brennan asked Mary to sit with him on the porch. They sat in the dark, the way they had sat many nights, but this time Brennan tried to ask a different kind of question. He said that he wanted to know if she had known about the Comanche movements before they happened. If she had been able to prevent a massacre or a catastrophe, would she have done something? Would she have found a way to change the outcome? Mary was quiet for a long time. The sound of the prairie came to them, winged through the grass, the distant call of an animal, the silence underneath everything. Finally, she spoke. She said that he was asking her the wrong question. She said that he was asking whether she would have betrayed him for her people. And that was the wrong question because it assumed that betrayal and loyalty were simple things, that they pointed in single directions, that a person could not hold both at the same time. She said that she had done something. She said that the canyon had failed because she had sent a message north about the timing and the location. She said that she had done this not for revenge and not to harm the militia, but because she knew the larger Comanche band would not be there, and she knew that the cavalry officer's plan would either capture or kill the smaller group, and the smaller group contained her brother. She said that she had made a choice to protect her brother at a cost. The cost had been borne by a cavalry officer and a rancher and a settler family and Brennan himself. The cost had been borne by a territory that would never know what had actually happened, because the explanation was too complicated and too human for anyone to believe. She said that she had made this choice as quietly as she could. She had not asked for Brennan's permission. She had not told him what she was doing. And she had paid the price of that choice by watching him doubt her, by listening to the community's suspicion, by accepting that she might be killed for what she had done. Brennan sat with this knowledge, feeling its weight settle over him. He asked her if her brother had survived the canyon. Mary said that she didn't know. She said that she had sent a message, but she couldn't know what had happened to the people who received it. She said that was the burden of making choices in this territory. You could act, but you couldn't control the outcome, and you had to live with the consequences regardless. Brennan asked her if she knew who was actually feeding information to the cavalry officer, who the real traitor was that Harrow was now hunting. Mary said that she had heard rumors in Spanish Creek. She said that the man who ran the telegraph office had been identified as the likely suspect. She said that the telegraph operator had a sister who was married to a Comanche man, and he had been helping coordinate safe passage and communication for several years. She said that the operator had warned her people about militia movements, not out of loyalty to the Comanche, but out of loyalty to his sister, out of a desire to keep her alive. Brennan asked her how she knew this. Mary said that the territory was smaller than he thought. Information moved between communities the way it always moved through family, through obligation, through the bonds that existed whether you acknowledged them or not. She said that she had learned this about the territory by living in it, by watching it, by understanding that every person was connected to multiple worlds, and that those worlds could pull in opposite directions. Then Brennan understood the full weight of the situation. The cavalry officer's theory was correct. There was a traitor in the territory, someone coordinating with the Comanche. But the traitor was not Mary. The traitor was someone else entirely, a man acting out of family loyalty, out of love for a sister. And Mary had taken action to protect her brother from an ambush that would have succeeded. An ambush that the actual traitor had helped coordinate, but that Mary had managed to disrupt. But Harrow had taken the existence of a traitor as confirmation that Mary was guilty, because Mary was the easiest person to accuse, because the narrative of a Comanche woman signaling her people was the one that required the least effort to believe, because Harrow wanted Brennan destroyed and had found a way to accomplish it that would make the destruction look like protection. The violence, when it came, did not come the way Waller had described it. It came differently, more suddenly, with less warning. It came in the night, in the form of a fire started in the northwest section of the compound where hay and feed were stored. It came with the knowledge that the fire would move toward the main house if the wind stayed true. It came with noisemen riding, shouting, the organized chaos of crisis that was designed to look like accident or coincidence. And it came with a choice. Brennan stood on the porch as the fire grew, watching it spread with unnatural speed, understanding that someone had used accelerant, that this was not random, that this was coordinated. He could see Harrow and his men moving through the shadows beyond the fire, could see them watching the house, could see that they were waiting for something, waiting for Brennan to panic, waiting for Mary to try to escape, waiting for the situation to unfold in a way that would justify whatever they were going to do next. He understood that he had reached the moment that everything had been moving toward. He could save Mary by fighting the men who were coming. He could defend her as his wife and his responsibility. He could stand on his ground and do what a man was supposed to do. Or he could choose to be uncertain. He could choose to believe that the accusations had some basis. He could choose to let the momentum that Harrow had built carry events forward, could tell himself that he was choosing the pragmatic path, the path that would minimize bloodshed and suffering. Mary came out of the house behind him, and he heard her footsteps on the wooden porch. She stood beside him and watched the fire grow. She did not seem frightened. She seemed to be watching something that had been set in motion a long time ago and was now simply completing itself. Brennan asked her what she wanted him to do. Mary said that she wanted him to understand that she had made her choice, and that her choice had consequences, and that those consequences were hers to bear. She said that if he fought Harrow, if he stood beside her, he would be choosing to bear consequences that weren't his to carry. She said that she had come to this ranch knowing that it could not be permanent, knowing that the ties between her old life and this life could not be untangled without someone paying a price. Brennan said that he couldn't just let them take her, couldn't just stand aside and watch. Mary said that yes, he could. She said that letting her go was not the same as accepting what Harrow was doing. She said that she would go, and Harrow would think he had won, and the territory would think that order had been restored. But the truth would remain, the truth that Mary had sent a message to save her brother, and that Harrow had used that truth to destroy a life in order to consolidate power. She said that Brennan's choice was not between Mary and Harrow. His choice was between his own doubt and his own knowledge. He could let his doubt consume him, could allow Harrow to shape the narrative of their marriage, could live out his years wondering whether he had made the right decision. Or he could know with absolute certainty that whatever else Mary was, she was a person who had chosen to act with courage and specificity in a situation that offered no good options. The fire reached the edge of the main house, and they could hear the crackle of it, could feel the heat it generated. Harrow appeared at the edge of the light, and he was holding a gun, and he was moving toward the porch with the kind of certainty that comes from knowing you have sufficient force behind you. Mary moved down the porch steps before Harrow could reach them. She walked toward him with her hands visible, with no attempt to fight or flee. She walked as though she was choosing every step, as though this movement was something she had decided on, rather than something that had been decided for her. Brennan watched her walk away from the burning house, away from the ranch, away from him. He watched Harrow meet her and take her arm. He watched the men move with her back toward the horses, watched them mount, watched them disappear into the darkness beyond the fire. And then Brennan stood alone on the porch of a burning house, and he understood that the fire had solved nothing, had prevented nothing, had only made visible what had always been true. That Harrow had wanted Mary gone, and had used the machinery of the community's fear to accomplish it. That Brennan had allowed his own uncertainty to paralyze him, had allowed himself to be divided against his own wife by a man who understood the power of doubt. The fire burned through the night. The hands came out and fought it with water from the well, but they could not save the main house. They could only save the outbuildings, the ranch structures that were necessary for operation. By morning, the house was burned down to foundation and blackened wood, and the sun came up on a ranch that looked like a place that had been abandoned or destroyed. Callie came to Brennan where he sat on the remains of the porch and asked what had happened. Brennan said that Harrow had taken Mary, and Callie said that he knew that everyone in the territory knew that by now. Callie asked where Harrow had taken her, and Brennan said that he didn't know. The truth came out over the following weeks, in fragments and pieces, the way information always came out in the territory. Harrow had taken Mary north to the edge of the territory and had left her there in the dark with a horse and supplies. He had not killed her. He had simply released her back into the landscape, as if she were something that had wandered into civilization and needed to be returned to where it belonged. Whether she had made it back to her people, whether she had survived alone in the Northern Territories, whether she was alive at all, none of this was ever confirmed. The story of her release became the story of her betrayal in the retelling, became the story of how Harrow had driven her out of the territory and back to where she came from. The truth of what had actually happened, that Harrow had taken her in the night, had orchestrated her disappearance, had used the community's fear as cover for an act of violence, became something that no one quite remembered the same way. The cavalry officer came through Spanish Creek 3 months later with the captured telegraph operator. The operator had confessed to the charges, had admitted to coordinating with his sister, had admitted to warning the Comanche about militia movements. He was going to be tried and executed, and there was a kind of satisfaction in the community that justice had finally been achieved. But the truth about the raids, that they had been coordinated by 2 separate groups with 2 separate objectives, that one group was hunting supplies and the other was hunting safety, that the coordination had come from love and family obligation rather than from enemy coordination, this truth was never fully articulated. It was simpler to believe that there had been a single traitor, a single point of betrayal, a single act that could be punished and then left behind. Brennan rebuilt his ranch. He built a new house, smaller than the one that had burned, more utilitarian. He did not remarry. He did not leave the territory, though he had the means to do so. Instead, he remained where he was, managing his cattle, performing the work that occupied his daylight hours and distracted him from his thoughts. Years passed. Harrow became more powerful in the territory, was appointed to the territorial council, was given authority over militia operations in 3 counties. His reputation was built on his success in driving back the Comanche threat, on his willingness to take action when others hesitated, on his understanding of what needed to be done to preserve civilization in a savage place. Brennan watched this ascendancy and said nothing. He had no evidence that anyone would believe. He had no witness to what had happened except himself and Mary was gone. Harrow had been careful enough that plausible deniability surrounded his actions. The fire could have been set by anyone. The taking of Mary could have been necessary protective action. The narrative of Harrow as protector had become so established that any alternative explanation seemed like bitterness or special pleading. 10 years after the night of the fire, a woman came through Spanish Creek from the north. She was Comanche or half Comanche, and she carried herself with a kind of authority that suggested she had lived hard and understood the territories well. She asked to speak with Brennan, and Callie brought her to the ranch. They sat on the porch of the small new house, and the woman told Brennan that his wife had survived, that she had made it back to her people, that she had lived, and had learned to live with the choice she had made, and had come to understand that the cost of protecting her brother had been worth paying. The woman said that Mary had sent a message a long time ago, asking Brennan to understand that she had not come to his ranch intending to betray it, but that she had come to it knowing that her ties to her old life could not be fully severed. The woman said that Mary had come to understand that Brennan had made his own choice when he stood aside that night, and that his choice had protected him from becoming Harrow, but had also left him carrying the burden of uncertainty for the rest of his life. Brennan asked the woman why she had come now, why she was bringing this message years after the fact. The woman said that Mary had not come herself, because there was no return for her from where she had gone. But she had wanted Brennan to know that she had not regretted her choice, had not regretted the message she had sent, had not regretted protecting her brother, and that she had hoped, eventually, that Brennan would come to the same understanding, that some choices cannot be judged by their outcomes, but must be judged by the courage required to make them. After the woman left, Brennan sat alone on the porch and watched the sun move across the ranch. The cattle were grazing in the distance. The grass was green from recent rain. The sky held that particular quality of light that comes to the frontier in late afternoon. Everything was the same as it had always been. Nothing was the same as it had been. He understood finally that his doubt had not been a sign of his clarity or his realism. His doubt had been a sign of his fear, and his fear had been a sign of his love, and his love had been complicated by the fact that he had never fully believed that Mary could have made the choice to come to his ranch and stay in his ranch while maintaining ties to a world he could not fully comprehend. And he understood that Mary, for her part, had married him knowing that she was not promising a simple thing, not promising to become a different person or to sever ties that were rooted in blood and years and obligation. She had promised to build a life with him, and she had done that, in the way that a person promises something when they know the promise will be broken, and they make it anyway. The silence between Brennan and Mary had never been truly about communication. It had been about the gap between who they actually were and who they wanted to be for each other, and that gap could not be bridged by words or by acts of faith. It could only be endured and lived with, and finally accepted as the texture of a marriage between two people who loved each other but could never fully trust that the love was not always about to be taken away. The territory around Brennan's ranch continued to develop. More settlers came. The Comanche were pushed farther north. The violence gradually became less frequent, less visible, less a part of daily life. Harrow died, eventually, in a riding accident that no one quite believed was accidental, but that no one could prove was anything else. His power passed to other men, and his version of events became the official history of the territory. But somewhere in that history there was a gap, a place where the truth had been altered or erased. And in that gap lived the knowledge that a Comanche woman had once married a white rancher, and that she had made a choice that protected her brother, and to stabilize the certainty of men who believed in clear lines between civilization and savagery. And that a man had stood and watched her walk away from him, not because he had stopped loving her, but because he had never quite learned to believe in what his love was asking him to trust. In the end, the question was never whether Mary had betrayed the ranch. The question was whether Brennan had betrayed Mary by allowing his doubt to paralyze him, by accepting the narrative that Harrow had constructed, by letting the fear of the community determine the fate of a woman who had chosen him once and deserved to know, at least, that he believed in the choice she had made. The silence between them had been broken finally, but only long after she was gone, and long after any breaking could mend what had been damaged. And Brennan lived with that knowledge the way all men live with the consequences of choices made in fear, and choices not made because of doubt, with a weight that never quite diminishes, and with a recognition, finally, that some questions are not meant to have answers.
Thanks for watching this story till the end. Comment below and tell me where you're watching from. And before you go, check out these other amazing Western stories waiting for you next. Subscribe, like, and I'll see you on the next ride.